Napoleon Bonaparte was born on a warm summer day, the 15th of August, 1769, in the rugged town of Ajaccio, nestled on the island of Corsica. His family name, originally Buonaparte, bore the gentle cadence of Italian roots, but as the years would unfold, he would simplify it, shedding the U to better match the sharpness of his own voice and the swift stroke of his signature. Even after the thunderous days of the 13th Vendémiaire, that decisive moment in his early career, he still held on to the old spelling. Yet, whispers and rumours swirled around him like the ever-changing Corsican winds. Some claimed he was born a year earlier, that he had disguised his true age, but these tales were as unfounded as the shifting sands. He himself told me, with certainty, that his birthday was the 9th of August, a date close to my own, born on the 9th of July, 1769, and this closeness in age became a thread weaving our friendship tightly together during our days at the military college of Brienne. The register of Monsieur Berton, the sub-principal at Brienne, stands as a quiet witness to the truth. There, etched in ink, is the record of Napoleon de Bonaparte, écuyer, born in Ajaccio on that very August day in 1769, who left the Royal Military College on the 17th of October, 1784. His origins, too, were often misunderstood, clouded by tales of low birth, yet his family, though fallen on hard times, was noble, their fortunes diminished not by their own failings, but by the cruel hand of the Jesuits, who had stripped them of an inheritance. His father, Charles Bonaparte, had pleaded with the Minister of War for a commission for his young son, then only 14, and for his brother Lucien to enter the military school. The reply was a polite refusal. Two brothers cannot be placed at the same time in the military schools. So, Napoleon was sent to Paris to await the age required for his commission, while Lucien would follow only after his elder brother had left. The Bonaparte family had roots deep in the soil of Italy, their lineage traced back to Tuscany, though the storms of civil strife had driven them to Corsica. I shall not dwell on those turbulent times, for they belong to another tale. But I will share a glimpse into the boy's early life, tender and revealing, from the memoirs of the Duchesse d'Arbranes. It tells of a small, stubborn child, accused by his sister of stealing a basket of grapes, figs, and citrons, fruits belonging to their uncle, the canon. To eat what belonged to the uncle was a grave offence, far more serious than taking fruit from any common garden. Napoleon denied the charge, but was whipped and punished with 3 days of bread and cheese, a punishment he bore without tears, dull, but not sulky. Only on the 4th day did the truth emerge. A friend had confessed to the theft, and now it was his sister who faced punishment. When asked why he had not revealed the truth earlier, the boy replied with a quiet wisdom beyond his years. Out of consideration for his sister's friend, he had kept silent. He was but 7. Napoleon's childhood has been painted both in glowing hues and dark shadows, as is often the fate of those destined for greatness. He himself laughed at the many tales spun about his youth, tales that stretched credulity and reality alike. One such story, of his fortifying a garden against his schoolmates, arose from a winter long ago, when heavy snows blanketed the grounds of Brienne. The boys, restless and confined, sought amusement. Napoleon, ever the strategist, proposed a grand game of siege warfare in the courtyard, crafting trenches, parapets, and hornworks from snow and gravel. For 2 weeks they waged their mock battles, until the gravel mixed with snow stung like tiny bullets, and many were wounded in their play, myself among the sorest, bearing the marks of that playful grape shot. Another fanciful tale of a balloon ascent was attributed to him, but it was not he who soared skyward in that reckless adventure, but a comrade, Dudon de Chambon, whose eccentricities were well known. Napoleon's mind was drawn elsewhere, to the serious matters of politics and governance. During vacations, he sought the company of the Abbé Raynal, engaging in conversations about government, legislation, and commerce, topics far removed from childhood games. On festival days in Brienne, when townsfolk were allowed to join the school's amusements, strict order was maintained. Passes were required to enter, and ranks of officers and sub-officers were granted by merit. On one such day in 1782, the wife of the porter, a woman named Haute, tried to gain entry without a ticket, insisting on her right to attend. Napoleon, then a commanding young officer of the post, spoke with a tone of authority. "Send away that woman who comes here with her camp impudence." It was a small moment, yet it revealed his early decisiveness and command. Our friendship began when we were but 8 years old, a bond forged in the quiet understanding between two boys close in age. Napoleon's stern character was tempered by a shared sympathy, and though his demeanor often seemed cold, there was a sincerity beneath it. His thoughts often wandered to the conquest of Corsica, to the wounds inflicted upon his country and family, and this made him seek solitude. Yet in the classrooms of mathematics and belles lettres we were equals, partners in learning. When he arrived at Brienne, he spoke only Corsican, and under the guidance of Sieur Dupuis, the vice-principal, he quickly mastered French, then began Latin, though he disliked it fiercely, remaining in the lower classes for the language. But in mathematics, he soared above us all, solving problems with a swift ease that astonished me. I helped him with Latin, he aided me with numbers, a quiet exchange between friends. Physically, Napoleon was marked by the dark hue of his Corsican skin, a piercing gaze that seemed to see through all things, and a manner of speech that often bore a shadow of ill humor. This was no mere boyish temper, but the weight of his family's misfortunes and the loss of his homeland. At times, he was not well liked by his comrades, who teased him for his name, his accent, and his country's submission to France, a submission he mourned deeply. Yet I remained by his side, often finding him alone in the library, absorbed in the histories of Polybius, Plutarch, and Arrianus, though he cared little for Quintus Curtius. One day, when it was his turn to dine with Father Berton, the head of the school, some professors spoke disrespectfully of Paoli, the Corsican patriot whom Napoleon admired fiercely. Without hesitation, Napoleon defended him, declaring, "Paoli was a great man, he loved his country, and I will never forgive my father, who was his adjutant, for having concurred in the union of Corsica with France. He ought to have followed Paoli's fortune, and have fallen with him." Such words, spoken by a boy, carried the weight of a soul wounded by betrayal and loss. The Duchesse d'Abrante would later describe him as a boy whose greatness was not apparent in his youth, his head too large for his body, his anger terrible to behold, yet in moments of kindness, his eyes softened with a mildness that hinted at the man he would become. His smile could captivate, but his disdain was chilling. Of all the children of Signora Letitia, he seemed the least likely to rise, yet destiny had other plans. At Brienne, Napoleon's reserve and seriousness set him apart. He was not one for the laughter and games of his peers, often withdrawing into study and reflection. The monks who oversaw the school failed to understand him, mistaking his silence for dullness and his disdain for the arts and languages as stupidity. Yet his mind was a furnace of intelligence, seeking knowledge in mathematics and the sciences. If only the school had the means to nurture such talents. It was only after he left that the college sought to improve its teaching staff, bringing in professors from Paris to raise the level of education, too late for the boy who had already begun his journey into the wider world. And so, as night fell over the ancient walls of Brienne, the young Corsican's gaze remained fixed on horizons beyond the classroom, beyond the teasing and the cold winters, beyond the narrow corridors of the school. His mind was already marching forward, plotting, dreaming, and preparing for the battles that lay ahead. And so, as night fell, the march continued. In the quiet halls of the military college at Brienne, where the walls bore witness to the slow unfolding of young lives destined for service and sacrifice, there was a boy named Bonaparte. His mind, restless and peculiar, gravitated not toward the broad array of studies that filled the days of his peers, but fixated instead on the cold precision of mathematics. The monks who tended the college, humble and lacking in resources, could scarcely grasp the spark within him, nor could they provide the nurturing guidance that a genius might demand. It was only after Bonaparte's departure that the college sought to enliven its fading reputation by bringing in two professors from Paris, Durfort and Despont, whose arrival marked a turning point, yet came too late to shape the young Corsican's early education. The oft-repeated tales of a thorough schooling at Brienne, then, stand at odds with the reality of narrow instruction and limited opportunity, a truth that weighs with a certain melancholy when one reflects on the promise buried in those early years. Bonaparte bore the cold shoulder of his comrades with a dignity that shunned complaint. When duty called and others faltered, he chose silence and even imprisonment over betrayal, standing firm with a stubborn loyalty to his own code. On one occasion, I was drawn into his silent rebellion, accompanying him to a prison cell where we lingered for 3 days, sharing the punishment that came with a failure to enforce the rules we oversaw. These trials, though harsh, were endured with a grim resolve, a lesson in endurance that would later echo through a lifetime of hardship and relentless ambition. The year 1783 brought a brief shimmer of grandeur to the austere college, as the Duke of Orléans and Madame de Montesson descended upon Brienne. For more than a month, the stately chateau of the Comte de Brienne transformed into a miniature Versailles, its halls echoing with the laughter and pageantry of royal entertainments. The young students, caught between the humble realities of their daily discipline and the dazzling spectacle of noble presence, found themselves momentarily swept into a world far beyond their usual ken. At the prize distribution, Bonaparte and I were honored in mathematics, the one realm where his focus was absolute and his talent undeniable. Madame de Montesson, wearied by the repeated calls upon her hands to bestow these awards, gently urged my mother to crown me herself, a small gesture that lingered as a tender memory amid the stern lessons of those years. An inspector of military schools, charged with the solemn duty of reporting on each pupil's progress, painted a portrait of Bonaparte that was neither glowing nor dismissive, but marked by a steady, if unremarkable, diligence. The report, penned by Monsieur de Carvalho in 1784, described a boy of modest stature, robust health, obedient character, and a particular devotion to mathematics. In history and geography he was competent, but Latin, a cornerstone of classical education, lagged behind. The inspector's prediction was cautious. Bonaparte might yet become an excellent sailor, a prospect that seemed distant from the boy's own ambitions. Indeed, the report hinted at a stubbornness, a domineering spirit that some found difficult, a trait that would later shape both his triumphs and his trials. Despite the official record, whispers and letters from his family spoke of a young man torn between paths, urged toward the navy by counsel and circumstance, yet repelled by the infantry's dull routine. His father's hopes shifted with each twist of fate, seeking to guide him toward the artillery after naval aspirations faltered, a path that would eventually lead him to Paris and to the crucible of his future. At 15 years and 2 months, Bonaparte stepped into the bustling life of the Military College of Paris, a place far grander and more expensive than the modest halls of Brienne. His arrival was marked by a curious mixture of wonder and alienation, as recounted by those who glimpsed his solitary figure wandering the Palais Royal, eyes wide with the astonishment of a boy thrust suddenly into a vast, unfamiliar world. His temper, sharp and sometimes bitter, set him apart from the easy camaraderie of his peers, and even those who sought his friendship found only a guarded reserve, a cold politeness that hinted at deeper storms within. Our paths diverged then, as I accompanied him to the outskirts of Nogent-sur-Seine, where the coach would carry him deeper into the city's embrace. We parted with a quiet sorrow, unaware of the many years and the turbulent events that would pass before we met again. Letters travelled between us, threads of connection amid the unfolding chaos of revolution and war, but none foretold the towering destiny that awaited him, a destiny that would soon eclipse the modest beginnings of our youth. In those early days in Paris, Bonaparte's keen mind did not rest. He turned a critical eye upon the military school itself, penning a memorial to the vice-principal Berton of Brienne, decrying the excess and expense that marked its operation. Though advised to silence, the impulse to reform and to challenge the status quo burned brightly within him, a flame that would never be fully extinguished. This tension between grandeur and austerity, between public magnificence and private economy, would become a guiding principle in his life, a balance of show and substance that only the most driven could maintain. And so, with the weight of expectation pressing upon his slender shoulders, Napoleon Bonaparte began his journey in the heart of Paris, a city on the cusp of upheaval, where the echoes of ancient power mingled with the restless stirrings of revolution. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with hardship. The long nights of study, the cold barracks, the whispered rivalries, and the relentless march of time. But within him burned a hunger for glory that no obstacle could quell. And so, as night fell, the march continued. In the quiet halls of the military school at Brienne, a young Napoleon Bonaparte pondered deeply the nature of education and the character it sought to forge. At 16, his mind was already sharp, his observations keen, and his convictions unyielding. He saw clearly the folly in the prevailing system, a system that nurtured vanity and ostentation among the sons of modest gentlemen, filling them with a hollow pride that distanced them from their humble origins and the sturdy virtues of simplicity and duty. He imagined instead a regimen where these young men would learn the value of temperance and self-reliance, brushing their own clothes, cleaning their own boots, sharing the coarse bread of soldiers, and hardening themselves through activity and discipline. For in such trials, he believed, lay the strength to endure the harsh seasons and brutal fatigues of war, and to command respect from the soldiers they would one day lead. This was Napoleon's truth, a principle he never abandoned, as the later establishment of the military school at Fontainebleau would attest. But Napoleon's forthrightness and restless spirit did not endear him to his superiors. They hastened his examination, eager to see him depart, and soon he obtained a sub-lieutenancy in the artillery, a first step into the vast world beyond the school's walls. Yet the years that followed were marked by restless ambition and wandering, a young man seeking his place amid the swirling currents of Europe's changing tides. When denied entry into the artillery in 1787, he journeyed to Vienna, carrying a letter of recommendation to Monsieur de Montmorin at the French embassy. There, he was twice granted audience with Emperor Joseph, whose gracious manners and elegant conversation left a lasting impression on the young Corsican's mind. Guided by Monsieur de Noailles, Napoleon was encouraged to study the law of nations and foreign tongues at a German university, and so he moved on to Leipzig, just as the rumblings of revolution began to stir in France. In Leipzig, he devoted himself to study, absorbing the law of nations and the rhythms of German and English, before venturing through Prussia and Poland. He spent a cold winter in Warsaw, where the warmth of Polish hospitality awaited him in the home of Princess Tyszkiewicz, niece to the last king of Poland and sister to Prince Poniatowski. There, amidst evenings spent in the company of the king himself, surrounded by the flickering candlelight of intimate conversation, Napoleon read aloud from the Moniteur, the revolutionary paper whose speeches stirred the hearts of the Girondists. The princess, a lover of French literature, even sought to bring to Warsaw a translation he had made of Kotzebue's play, known in England as The Stranger, a work he retitled L'Inconnu, the Unknown One. But the peaceful halls of Vienna were soon overshadowed by death. On the 26th of March, 1792, Napoleon learned of the grave illness of Emperor Leopold II, who passed away the following day. Rumors whispered through the city, poison, conspiracy, but such shadows were dispelled when the public was allowed to see the emperor's body lying in state. Napoleon himself witnessed the mournful spectacle twice, feeling the solemn weight of loss, but hearing no voice to confirm the dark suspicions that lingered in the air. Returning to Paris in April of that year, he found himself reunited with an old companion, Bonaparte, as he was still called then. Their friendship, forged in the corridors of their youth, rekindled amidst the uncertainty of their futures. Both were poor, their pockets light, their fortunes uncertain, yet their minds teemed with schemes and dreams. They were men of 23, restless and eager, casting about for opportunity in a city trembling on the brink of upheaval. Bonaparte dreamed of ventures in property, of renting and building houses to let for profit, plans that faltered beneath the weight of landlord demands and the fickleness of fortune. Meanwhile, Bonaparte sought employment at the War Office and his friend at Foreign Affairs, fortunes diverging but hopes intertwined. Their days drifted in a vagabond rhythm until the fateful 20th of June arrived, a day etched forever in the memory of Paris. As they strolled near the Palais Royal, a mob surged toward the Tuileries, ragged and armed with crude weapons, shouting curses and threats. Bonaparte, ever the keen observer, estimated their numbers at 5,000 or 6,000, a motley assembly of the city's most desperate and disillusioned souls. They pressed forward with reckless abandon, and Napoleon could scarcely contain his indignation. When the king appeared at the window, forced to wear the red cap of the mob, Bonaparte's voice rose in bitter scorn. "Che coglione!" he exclaimed. "What fools! Why have they let in all that rabble? They should sweep off 400 or 500 of them with the cannon. The rest would then scatter quickly enough." That evening, over a modest dinner paid for by his friend, Bonaparte's mind churned with analysis and foreboding. He spoke with dispassionate clarity about the causes and consequences of the insurrection, his words heavy with prescience. He foresaw the storms gathering on the horizon, the violence yet to come, and he was not mistaken. The 10th of August followed soon after, a day when the palace was stormed and the monarchy shaken to its core. By then, his friend had travelled to Stuttgart, appointed Secretary of Legation, and their paths diverged amid the chaos of revolution. Bonaparte himself, after the 10th of August, retreated to Corsica, disappearing from the Parisian stage until 1793. The tales of his movements grew tangled in rumour and error, some claiming he never returned to his island home, others suggesting secret visits to London or offers to serve foreign powers, stories as fleeting and uncertain as the smoke of battle. Yet, through it all, the bonds of friendship endured, even as they were tested by distance and the tides of war. Meanwhile, the young Secretary of Legation faced his own trials. A decree in March 1793 demanded the return of all French agents abroad, under penalty of being branded as émigrés, traitors to the Republic. To remain abroad was to risk exile, suspicion, and worse. His name was inscribed on the list of émigrés, a mark that would haunt him despite repeated efforts by Bonaparte himself to have it erased. The general, now rising in fame and power, pleaded with friends and officials, from his brother Louis to Berthier and Bernadotte, to clear his friend's name. Promises were made, letters exchanged, yet bureaucracy and neglect delayed the relief. It was only in the chill of November 1797, after persistent appeals, that the stain was finally lifted. During those years, as his friend fought and rose through the ranks, leading the charge at Toulon and carving his name into the annals of military glory, the Secretary of Legation remained a witness from afar. He lacked first-hand knowledge of those battles, but he held in his hands papers and writings bestowed by Bonaparte himself, glimpses into the mind and spirit of the man who was to become so great. Among these was a small pamphlet, Le Souper de Beaucaire, a conversation among soldiers and citizens, filled with fiery republican ideals that Napoleon later sought to suppress when he embraced a more autocratic path as consul. It was a window into a time when liberty burned brightly, before the shadows of power and ambition dimmed its light. And so, the story of these two young men, one a rising star of war and destiny, the other a faithful companion caught in the whirlwinds of revolution, unfolded against the vast, trembling backdrop of a world transformed by upheaval and bloodshed. Their paths would cross and diverge, their fortunes wax and wane, but the pulse of history beat steadily on, relentless and unyielding. And so, as night fell, the march continued. In the waning days of the turbulent year 1793, amidst the restless hum of revolution and the clamour of insurrection, a pamphlet emerged quietly into the world, its words unassuming yet pregnant with the fierce clarity of youthful insight. This modest dialogue, penned by a young officer of the army, unfolded like a sombre conversation beneath the heavy skies of southern France, where the city of Marseille teetered on the brink of rebellion against the Convention. The voices in this dialogue, the officer, a citizen of Nimes, a manufacturer from Montpellier, and a Marseillais citizen, wove a tapestry of tension and foreboding. The officer, with a steady and unyielding tone, laid bare the stark military realities. The old soldiers of Carteau, seasoned and unrelenting, would crush the insurgents with merciless precision. The Marseille citizen, though spirited, found his arguments faltering against such grim certitude, his threats to call upon the Spaniards only serving to isolate him further, drawing the wary eyes of his companions. Even Colonel Jung, reflecting upon these pages years later, sensed in the officer's words the unmistakable mark of a master of war, a mind both firm and precise amid the swirling chaos. It was a voice that, though rough at times with the peculiar cadence of Italianisms, bore the weight of rare circumspection and unshakable resolve, a voice that the members of the Convention would come to heed with a mixture of admiration and cautious hope. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of this pamphlet's creation, a silence enveloped it, a silence preserved through decades, untouched even amid the vast chronicles that would later emerge from the exile of St. Helena. Perhaps it was the youthful fervour, the rawness of revolutionary zeal mingled with nascent strategy, that made it a shadowed corner in the vast tapestry of Napoleon's writings, which more often revealed the calculating statesman than the impassioned idealist. As the revolution roared onward, a darker chapter unfolded, one marked by suspicion and peril. The young general, barely 25, found himself ensnared in a web of intrigue and accusation, summoned not by the glory he sought, but by the cold hand of arrest. It was the summer of 1794, a time when the very air trembled with the echoes of the Terror's last gasps and the fragile hope of renewal. The representatives Albita and Salicetti, figures of authority within the revolutionary armies, cast a shadow over Bonaparte's rising star. A mission to Genoa, entrusted to him with secret instructions to observe and report on fortifications, became the pretext for his downfall. The very journey that spoke of trust and confidence was twisted into suspicion. In the confusion following the fall of the Terror and the upheaval of the 9th Thermidor, envy and fear took root. Orders were drawn up to arrest the young general, to strip him of rank and dignity, and to drag him before the merciless Committee of Public Safety. Behind these cold decrees lay whispers of personal animosities and tangled rivalries. Madame Junot, in later years, would recount a curious tale of jealousy, of two suitors vying for the same woman's favor: Bonaparte, youthful and favored, and Salicetti, whose enmity may have been as much personal as political. Letters and sealed papers, held tightly in Salicetti's grasp, concealed secrets that stirred unease and suspicion. Yet, despite the weight of accusation and the looming threat of the scaffold, Bonaparte's life was spared, perhaps by a combination of fate, courage, and the inscrutable calculations of those who held his fate in their hands. For 13 days he was confined, a prisoner not of flesh alone, but of the swirling tides of revolution and distrust. Yet even in confinement, his spirit remained unbroken. He penned a letter, brief, sharp, and unyielding, a declaration of his innocence and loyalty to the Republic. He spoke of his sacrifices, his unwavering commitment to the revolutionary cause, the battles fought and won, the enemies faced without falter. He challenged his accusers, Salicetti, who knew him, and Albita, who did not, to produce a single shadow of proof against him. His words carried the weight of truth, the quiet dignity of a man wronged yet unbowed. He pleaded not merely for justice, but for the restoration of his honor among the patriots, for the lifting of the heavy hand that sought to crush him before hearing his voice. Slowly, the tide shifted. The representatives, perhaps moved by the clarity of his defense or the absence of evidence, revisited their judgments. The papers were examined anew, the orders scrutinized, and in the cool light of reason, the shadows of suspicion began to dissolve. On the 20th of August, a decree was issued. Bonaparte was provisionally set free, his name cleared, his talents acknowledged as a boon to the Republic. Yet the scars of this ordeal lingered, a reminder of the fragility of fortune in those perilous times. The story of this arrest and release, tangled with rivalries, misunderstandings, and the merciless machinery of revolutionary justice, reveals the precarious path trod by the young general. It is a tale not merely of political intrigue, but of personal endurance, of a spirit tested by fire and emerging, if not unscathed, then resolute. Salicetti, once an adversary, would later become a friend and confidant, though their relationship was never without its complexities and shadows. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the days of turmoil stretched onward, the march of history continued, marked by moments of peril and triumph, of suspicion and vindication. And so, as night fell, the march continued. General Bonaparte had returned to Paris, a city still trembling in the uneasy aftermath of revolution and war, where I soon found myself again by his side, having come from Germany. Our friendship, long paused by the storms of fate, rekindled quietly amidst the restless streets and shadowed cafes. He would speak to me often of the recent campaigns in the South, his voice carrying both the pride of his victories and the bitterness of the persecutions he had endured. He handed me a packet of papers, documents he wished to entrust to trusted friends, eager above all to dispel the dark whispers that he might have betrayed his country, that under the guise of a mission to Genoa he had become a spy. He spoke of Toulon and Italy with a glow in his eyes. Those early triumphs filled him with a deep, almost tender satisfaction, as though recalling a distant dream of glory just within reach. But soon the government sought to send him to La Vendée, to take command as a brigadier general of infantry, To Bonaparte, this was an affront. The battlefield of La Vendée, in his eyes, was unworthy of a man of his talents, and the very thought of abandoning the artillery, his chosen and cherished arm, for the infantry, rankled deeply. It was this last point, the insult of the transfer, that he pressed most fiercely, refusing the appointment outright. And so, in the cold machinery of revolutionary justice, the Committee of Public Safety struck him from the list of general officers. The blow was unexpected and sharp. The young general, full of fire and ambition, found himself cast aside, thrust into a forced exile within his own country. He withdrew from public life, lodging in a modest hotel near the Place des Victoires, the bustle of Paris swirling indifferently around him. Days stretched long and empty. The fiery spirit that had led armies now had no command but patience and hope. He waited, watching the ever-shifting tides of power, hoping that men more favorable to him might rise and restore his place. Our evenings together passed in gentle conversation, the hours softening with the ease of friendship. I visited him each morning, and at his lodgings I met figures of the time, including Salicetti, whose visits were frequent and intense, often marked by heated discussions and the exchange of urgent confidences. Once, when Bonaparte's finances were strained, Salicetti lent him 3,000 francs in assignats for the sale of his carriage, a small mercy in a time of hardship. His poverty was no secret. Madame Junot would later recall those months in Paris when Bonaparte, despite his sharp mind and noble ambition, lived in want. His family, driven from Corsica, had found refuge in Marseille and could only offer limited support. Junot remembered their walks along the boulevard, where young men paraded on fine horses, adorned with the trappings of fashion and favor. Bonaparte would rail against such frivolity, mocking the dandies with their painted whiskers and empty praises, lamenting how fortune seemed to smile upon such hollow souls while he lingered in obscurity. Grand Dieu, how contemptible is human nature, he would say, voice low but fierce. Yet beneath this exterior, a restless mind churned. It was clear to me that Bonaparte sought initiation into the tangled webs of political intrigue, bound perhaps by oaths and secrets whispered in the shadows. His mood grew darker, more pensive, as he awaited Salicetti's visits with a mixture of hope and anxiety. News came that Salicetti had been implicated in the insurrection of May 20th, 1795, and was forced to flee to Venice, leaving Bonaparte to wrestle alone with his uncertain fate. At times, he would cast a wistful glance toward his brother Joseph, newly married to Mademoiselle Clary, whose fortune and stability seemed a world away from his own precarious existence. "That Joseph is a lucky rogue," he would murmur, a faint smile touching his lips, a rare moment of light in the gathering gloom. But the months slipped by, and no door opened for him. His applications and plans were met with silence or refusal. The sting of injustice and the hunger for action gnawed at his soul. He could not bear the thought of fading into the crowd, lost and forgotten. A bold idea took root, a dream of the East, where the sun rose over distant lands and glory awaited those daring enough to seize it. Constantinople called to him, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a realm vast and untamed, where he might carve a new destiny. He asked if I would accompany him, to share in this venture across seas and deserts, but I declined, seeing him as a restless spirit, driven to desperation by his circumstances, his mind racing toward wild and uncertain horizons. He bore no grudge at my refusal, telling me instead that Junot, Marmont, and other young officers from Toulon stood ready to follow him into any adventure. In the quiet hours, he put pen to paper, drafting a note, a plan without addressee, a vision of what might be. Days later, he revised it and sent it on to Aubert and Coney, a clear and earnest proposal that spoke to the heart of his ambition. The note began with a reflection on the shifting alliances of Europe. The Empress of Russia united with the Emperor of Austria, and the pressing need for France to bolster the military strength of Turkey. He spoke of the Turkish militia, numerous, brave, yet lacking in the scientific mastery of war's modern arts, especially in artillery, where France excelled and where the Turks were most deficient. France had sent officers before, but they had been too few, too weak in talent, to make a lasting difference. General Bonaparte, he wrote, had served in artillery from youth, commanding it at the siege of Toulon and through campaigns in Italy. He offered his services to the French government to lead a mission to Turkey, bringing with him 6 or 7 officers skilled in every aspect of the military craft. His aim was to strengthen the Turkish power, to complete the defenses of their principal fortresses, and to build new ones. This, he believed, would be a service to France and a path to his own glory. This note, so carefully composed, dispels the rumor that he meant to enter Turkish service against Austria. At that time, the two empires were not at war, and Bonaparte made no mention of such a thing. It was a plan of alliance and strengthening, not betrayal. And so the restless young general, locked in the shadows of Parisian politics and waiting for a chance to rise, dreamed of distant lands and great deeds. His heart was set on the east, on the promise of new fields where his talents might bloom. But fate, as ever, had other paths in store. And so, as night fell, the march continued. In those uncertain days, Bonaparte sought a path where he might serve his country and carve a place for himself in the world. He had entertained a notion, a hope perhaps, that by aiding the Turkish power, strengthening their fortresses, building new defenses, he might find a purpose worthy of his restless ambition. It was not a plan born of enmity toward Austria, for the two nations were not then at war, but rather a practical attempt to make himself useful, to be of some service in the tumultuous currents of Europe. Yet, no answer came to his note, no invitation, no opportunity. Turkey remained unaided, and Bonaparte remained still, caught in the quiet pause before the storm. It is tempting to imagine how different history might have been had a simple clerk in the War Office penned the word "granted" upon that note. Such a small word, yet one that might have altered the fate of nations, the course of empires. Instead, Bonaparte stayed in Paris, his mind alive with schemes and desires, his heart burning for a chance to leave his mark upon the world. But obstacles blocked every path he tried to follow, and the city around him was a stage of unrest and uncertainty. Women, it is said, see the truth of a man's character more clearly than men do. Madame de Bourrienne, who knew Bonaparte well in those early days, kept notes of her impressions, moments that lingered in her memory, revealing the man behind the fervour. She spoke of an evening in May when they met him at the Palais Royal near a humble shop, where he greeted Bourrienne with warmth, a friend glad to see another. That night they went to the Théâtre Français, where laughter filled the air, where the audience was swept away by the comic performance of Le Sourd ou l'Auberge Plaine. Yet Bonaparte sat apart, silent and cold, untouched by the joy that rippled through the crowd. His smile was rare, often forced, and behind his eyes lay a shadow, a gloom that seemed to cloak his very being. Madame de Bourrienne recalled a story he told, one that chilled her deeply. It was of an officer at Toulon, a brave man, tenderly loved by his wife. When the order came for another assault, the officer's wife pleaded with Bonaparte to spare her husband from the danger. But the general, she said, was inexorable, his heart hardened with a savage resolve. And when the battle raged and a shell hurtled toward them, Bonaparte warned the officer, yet the man did not move, and was torn apart before his eyes. Bonaparte laughed as he recounted the grim tale, a laughter that seemed to echo with something cruel and unyielding. They saw him often then, as he came to dine with them in those days of scarcity, when bread was rationed in small, harsh portions. Bonaparte and his brother Louis brought their own hard, bran-mixed bread, sharing it with the aide-de-camp, while the family secretly provided the general with finer fare, smuggled flour baked into delicate pastries, a small rebellion against the hunger and hardship that pressed upon the city. For 6 weeks, the days flowed in this strange mixture of hope and tension. The theatres, the concerts, the evenings filled with music and light, all set against the backdrop of a city still healing from the terror of Robespierre's reign. Bonaparte's presence was always marked by a curious restlessness. He would slip away without a word, vanish from their sight, only to be found again, alone in a distant box, brooding and withdrawn. Before their departure for Sens, where Madame de Bourrienne was to give birth, they sought more comfortable lodgings. Bonaparte, ever the companion in these small quests, looked at a house across the street, dreaming aloud of a life shared with friends and family, a cabriolet waiting to carry him through the streets of Paris. But that simple vision was not to be. Other, greater events were gathering, and Bonaparte's fate was shifting beneath his feet. Letters once warm and affectionate between him and a school friend vanished, stolen in the shadows of those turbulent times. When they returned to Paris in November, the friend had become a man of power, commander of the city after the Vendémiaire uprising. The modest house was replaced by a grand hotel, the humble cabriolet by a splendid carriage. Bonaparte himself was changed, no longer the equal companion to his old friends, but a rising star, distant and aloof, mingling with the likes of Madame Tallien, Madame de Beauharnais, the women who moved in the glittering circles of influence and ambition. After the 13th of Vendémiaire, Bourrienne's encounters with Bonaparte grew rare and distant. Then came the cruel morning of February, when Bourrienne was seized at dawn, accused of being a returned émigré, torn from his wife and infant child, with barely time to dress. The cold hands of the law dragged him through the streets, to the guardhouse, to the grim precincts of the prefecture of police, a place where the lowest and most desperate men were held. 2 nights and a day he endured the darkness and the company of criminals, while those who loved him searched desperately for aid. Among those they turned to was Bonaparte, now a man of influence, but even he seemed slow to respond. The commandant of Paris was elusive, absent into the night, and only with persistence did Madame de Bourrienne secure an audience. She pleaded for her husband's life, for mercy, but the general's heart appeared hardened, his concern distant. He promised to write to Merlin, the Minister of Justice, but when the letter was delivered, the minister himself dismissed the plea with a cold hand, saying the matter was beyond his control. And so, as night fell, the march continued.